It's a warm, oppressive afternoon in the heart of the Pacific, the air thick with humidity. The sun beats down relentlessly as the clattering sound of boots on gravel echoes through the narrow, makeshift corridors of the prison camp. The year is 1944, and the war is reaching a pivotal point. On this remote island, far from the bustling cities of the world, a small group of women is about to face a moment that will forever change their understanding of survival, dignity, and the brutal reality of war. Inside the camp, the women have been separated from the men for months, even years. They have endured hunger, exhaustion, and the constant specter of violence. The guards, many of whom are Japanese soldiers themselves, maintain an iron grip on the prisoners. They treat the women with disdain, viewing them as little more than trophies of war to be kept in check. The prisoners are told what to do, when to do it, and how to live. The rules are clear. Keep your head down. Don't speak unless spoken to, and above all, don't defy authority. But there is one unwritten rule that the prisoners have come to rely on for a sense of control over their own fates: the complete separation of men and women. This rule has governed their existence in the camp for months. Men eat in one area, women in another. Men sleep in one building, women in another. The divide is absolute, and it is enforced with ruthless precision. For these women, it is a measure of both safety and survival. The men, once comrades, once friends, are now a distant, forbidden presence, but today, everything changes. The guards have gathered the prisoners together in the main courtyard, a small, fenced-off area where they are usually allowed to stretch their legs and get some fresh air. The women are lined up in neat rows, their clothes worn thin from months of use, their faces drawn from malnutrition and the weight of their captivity. Their eyes are tired, but there is a quiet defiance in their gaze. They have learned not to show weakness, not to show fear. It is the only way to survive. As the soldiers bark orders, the women begin to murmur among themselves. There is a buzz of confusion in the air, and for a moment it feels like something significant is about to happen. The guards motion for them to be silent, and the courtyard falls into an eerie stillness. Then, without warning, a door opens at the far side of the yard. From behind the heavy wooden frame, a group of men emerge, prisoners like themselves, but from a different section of the camp. And in that moment, everything the women have known about their world is shattered. The men walk toward the women, slowly, reluctantly. The soldiers' orders are clear, but the women are frozen, unable to comprehend what is unfolding before them. The separation, the rigid boundaries that have defined their world, are being torn down in an instant. As the men and women come face to face, a profound silence fills the air. No one knows what to do. The tension is palpable. For the women, this is an unimaginable sight. They had been taught that the presence of men, especially in such a personal setting, was a violation of every rule they had been given. They had learned to fear the men, to keep their distance, and now they are faced with an undeniable reality. Men and women eating together, living together in a way that defies everything they had been taught. The very notion of what it means to be a prisoner in this war is changing before their eyes. But beyond the shock and confusion, there's also a flicker of something else. A realization that they are not as powerless as they once believed. The rigid rules of the camp, the barriers between men and women, may be just as fragile as the women themselves. As the Japanese women prisoners stood in disbelief, faced with the unprecedented sight of men and women sharing a meal, it was clear that the world they had known was unraveling. What they were witnessing was not just a break in the camp's regulations. It was a reflection of the larger changes unfolding in the Pacific during World War II. This moment, though seemingly insignificant in its immediate context, was deeply embedded in the shifting tides of the war, a war that had already stretched across the globe for nearly 5 years, leaving scars and untold stories across continents. To understand the significance of this event, one must first step back and view it in the larger framework of the Pacific theater of World War II. By 1944, Japan had been embroiled in a brutal conflict that had already claimed millions of lives. The Imperial Army had advanced deep into China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, bringing with it a regime of fear and repression. Japan's military leadership, under the command of the emperor, maintained a strict, hierarchical structure that governed every aspect of civilian and military life. Their idea of maintaining order was enforced through violence, intimidation, and the separation of civilians, including women, from the outside world. For the women in the camp, the war had been a shattering event. Their lives, once full of routine and stability, were abruptly thrown into chaos as their homes were destroyed, their families torn apart, and their futures left uncertain. The women who found themselves imprisoned in the remote Pacific camps were often civilian workers, nurses, or simply women who had been caught in the path of a rapidly advancing war machine. Many of them had been taken as prisoners during Japan's conquests in the Philippines, China, and the Dutch East Indies. The brutality of their captors was not just a reflection of military discipline, but a cultural mandate to show superiority and enforce control. By 1944, the Japanese war effort was beginning to falter. The tide of the war had shifted dramatically in favor of the Allied forces, particularly after the Battle of Midway in 1942, a decisive victory for the United States Navy. Midway was the first major blow to Japan's imperial ambitions, and from that point forward, Japan found itself on the defensive. The once feared Japanese naval fleet was being systematically destroyed, and their supply lines to the Pacific Islands were steadily being choked off by the relentless push of Allied forces. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought in October 1944, was one of the largest naval battles in history and a decisive moment in the Pacific theater. The battle not only crushed Japan's naval power, but also heralded the beginning of the end for the empire. As the Allies continued their march across the Pacific, liberating islands and pushing ever closer to Japan's homeland, the women in the prison camps were oblivious to the global developments that were about to change their fate. The Allies' island-hopping campaign, led by General Douglas MacArthur, was proving successful. The liberation of the Philippines, the conquest of Iwo Jima, and the upcoming invasion of Okinawa signaled the beginning of the end of Japan's resistance. The Japanese, however, remained deeply committed to their cause, relying on a culture of loyalty and sacrifice that permeated every level of their society. For the women in the camp, this resolve was something they had experienced firsthand. The Japanese military believed in absolute obedience and subjugation, and this belief was reflected in their treatment of prisoners. In the midst of this, the women had been taught to accept their lot with stoicism, to endure suffering without complaint, and to embrace their role in the war as a necessity. They had been separated from the men, kept in isolation, and forced to endure the harsh conditions of the camp. The daily routine of the prison was one of deprivation, fear, and uncertainty. Yet, as the war began to turn against Japan, a shift in the atmosphere of the camp became evident. The Allied forces, having advanced through the Philippines, began to intensify their airstrikes against the Japanese mainland. The bombardment of Japanese cities, such as Tokyo, was relentless, and the psychological toll on both the soldiers and civilians back in Japan was profound. Meanwhile, the women in the camp heard rumors of Japan's defeat, of the changing balance of power in the Pacific. As their captors became more desperate and their command structure began to crumble, the women began to sense that their fate, too, was changing. In the months leading up to the event that would alter their world, the Allied forces, led by the United States, made significant progress in their efforts to cripple Japan's war machine. The Battle of Iwo Jima in February 1945 and the subsequent campaign on Okinawa were pivotal moments in the Allied strategy. These battles brought the Allies closer to Japan's doorstep, and with each victory the Japanese resolve began to crack. The hope that Japan could still win the war was diminishing, and the women, locked away in their camps, felt the slow but inevitable tightening of the noose around their captors' necks. But it was not just the battlefields where change was coming. The very nature of captivity was being redefined. The sight of men and women eating together in the camp was symbolic of the broader breakdown of the rigid social structures that had governed the prisoners' lives. The Japanese military, as disciplined and organized as it was, had always maintained strict control over the lives of the prisoners. Now, as the war neared its end, those same military authorities were finding it more difficult to maintain control. The breakdown of order within the camp reflected the larger collapse of the imperial system that had governed Japan for decades. The women, for the first time in months, saw an opening, a crack in the system that had held them in check. They were faced with a paradox. The same system that had stripped them of their humanity and dignity was now crumbling, and with it, Their former captors were losing their grip on the power they had once held. This moment, as insignificant as it may have seemed at first, was the first glimmer of hope for the prisoners. It marked the beginning of the end of their isolation, their separation, and their torment. As the women stood in stunned silence, watching the men approach and preparing to sit down beside them, the scene before them represented more than just a logistical change in the prison camp's routine. It was a profound shift in their reality, one that reverberated far beyond the immediate confines of their captivity. To truly understand this moment, we must examine it from multiple perspectives: human, tactical, leadership, and moral. The human perspective begins with the women themselves. These women were not soldiers, nor were they trained to withstand the ravages of war. They were civilians, often caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Many had been taken from their homes, torn away from their families, and forced into a world where survival was a daily struggle. The emotional weight of their captivity was immense. Every moment in the camp was an exercise in endurance, and every day was marked by uncertainty. The strict separation from the men, once seen as a necessity for their safety, was now a deeply ingrained part of their daily lives. The rules of the camp dictated that the women remained apart from the men, and they had grown used to this order. They had learned to survive without the emotional or physical support of their male counterparts, and for many the men were distant, almost mythic figures. Yet in this moment, as they stood side by side with the men for the first time in months, it was as though the very foundation of their world had been shaken. The presence of the men, once an abstract and forbidden concept, was no longer a matter of distance or separation. It was real. It was human, and it created a space for a new kind of solidarity, one forged in the shared experience of suffering. The women, for the first time, saw the men not as distant figures of authority, but as fellow human beings, equally subjected to the cruelties of war. This was a powerful realization. The emotional bond between them, once severed by the harsh rules of the camp, had been reawakened. From a tactical perspective, the decision to allow men and women to eat together was significant. It was an anomaly in the rigid structure of the Japanese prison system, one that disrupted the carefully orchestrated control that had been maintained for so long. The separation of men and women was a symbolic representation of the strict hierarchy that governed the camp. It was also a means of maintaining order, of preventing any semblance of solidarity or camaraderie that might threaten the established power dynamics. In the larger context of the war, however, this shift mirrored the broader changes taking place on the front lines. As the Allied forces made significant gains, the Japanese military was being pushed back. The once impenetrable fortress of the Japanese war machine was now vulnerable. The command structure was fraying, and the psychological toll on the Japanese soldiers, already stretched thin by years of conflict, was evident. The men in the prison camp were no longer the powerful, commanding figures they had once been. They were fellow prisoners just as the women were, and the soldiers, who had once enforced the rigid separation between the sexes, were now unable to maintain the same level of control. The tactical advantage of division was slipping away, both in the camp and on the battlefield. The psychological strain on the men was profound. They were no longer the victors. They were on the losing side, watching as the war that had once seemed winnable turned against them. Leadership, too, was undergoing a transformation. The Japanese command in the camp had been absolute. Orders came from the top down, and the men who enforced these orders were often unyielding in their devotion to the imperial system. However, as the war turned against Japan, the morale of the Japanese military was in decline. The realization that they were losing the war was not only a strategic blow, but also a psychological one. The rigid discipline that had been the hallmark of the Japanese military was eroding. The guards in the camp were feeling the pressure of this collapse. Their authority was no longer absolute, and the control they had once wielded over the prisoners was slipping away. The decision to break the rules, to allow men and women to share a meal, was in some ways an indication that the guards' power was waning. It was a rare crack in the facade of discipline that had defined the camp. The prisoners, both men and women, could see it. The psychological and emotional toll of the war was now reflected in the weakness of the camp's leadership. The moral dimension of this moment cannot be overlooked. For the women, Being forced to live under such harsh conditions had already strained their sense of self-worth. They had been humiliated, controlled, and isolated. The separation from the men was a psychological tool used by their captors to maintain a sense of power. But in allowing the men and women to eat together, the captors had inadvertently stripped away the last vestige of their control. This was more than a mere rule change. It was a crack in the moral framework that had justified the mistreatment of the prisoners. The guards may have thought they were maintaining discipline, but in reality they were showing the women and men alike that the war was no longer under their control. They were on the brink of losing everything. The psychological toll on the women was immense. For months they had endured the isolation, the fear, and the uncertainty. Now they were confronted with the challenge of navigating a new reality. The men were no longer strangers, they were comrades, fellow survivors in the same war. And for the first time in a long while, the women felt a sense of hope. This small, seemingly insignificant act, eating together, was a symbol of something much larger. It represented the breaking down of barriers, of the psychological and physical distance that had been forced between them. And as the men and women sat down together, it was a quiet rebellion. A rebellion against the oppressive system that had sought to break them, to divide them, and to strip them of their humanity. In the end, this moment was a turning point, not just in the camp but in the broader narrative of the war. It marked the beginning of the end of Japan's imperial reign. The moment of shared humanity between the men and women was a small act, but one with profound consequences. It foreshadowed the collapse of the Japanese system of control, the disintegration of the rigid military hierarchy, and the eventual liberation of the prisoners. The world outside the prison camp was changing rapidly. In the Pacific, the Allied forces were pushing forward relentlessly, gaining ground in the final stages of the war. The tide of battle had irrevocably turned in favor of the Allies, and Japan's days as a formidable military power were numbered. The consequences of the event in the camp, the moment when men and women ate together, though seemingly minor, were a reflection of the broader collapse of the imperial war effort. In the immediate aftermath of that day, the camp's atmosphere changed. The women, once isolated in their suffering, began to see the possibility of solidarity. No longer separated by arbitrary rules, they shared meals, stories, and even moments of laughter with the men, many of whom were still in shock themselves. For the first time in years, there was a sense of unity within the camp. The walls that had kept the prisoners apart, both physically and emotionally, began to crumble. The guards, aware of this shift, tried to reassert their authority, but the power dynamics had already begun to change. For the women, this was a significant moment of psychological liberation. They had spent months, if not years, living under the shadow of fear and isolation. They had been reduced to mere objects of war, controlled and subjugated by their captors. Yet the sight of men and women eating together was a small but powerful act of defiance. It was a reminder that they were not powerless. The rigidity of the camp's rules had been broken, and the psychological barriers that had kept the prisoners divided were beginning to weaken. The moment represented a new form of resistance, not through violence or rebellion, but through the quiet reclamation of human dignity. The aftermath of this shift was felt beyond the camp's fences. As the Allied forces drew nearer to Japan's heartland, the military leadership in Japan began to understand the full extent of their impending defeat. By mid-1945, the Japanese military was in disarray. The emperor, once seen as a divine figure, was losing his grip on power. The nation's infrastructure was in ruins, and the civilian population had been decimated by the ongoing bombings. The sense of invincibility that had sustained Japan's imperial ambitions for years was crumbling, and with it, the entire system that had governed the lives of prisoners like those in the camp. The psychological toll on the Japanese soldiers was immense. They had spent years in a war that they believed they could win, only to watch as their hopes disintegrated in the face of overwhelming Allied power. The guards at the prison camp were no different from the soldiers fighting on the front lines. They too were caught in the same cycle of fear and hopelessness. The breakdown of authority in the camp was a reflection of the collapse of the imperial system itself. On the day that Japan finally surrendered, the prisoners in the camp, both men and women, learned of the war's end. The news was met with a mixture of relief, disbelief, and even sadness. The war, which had claimed so many lives, had finally come to an end, but for the prisoners, the aftermath was bittersweet. They had survived the brutality of captivity, but the scars of their experiences would never fade. For many of them, the end of the war was not the end of their suffering. It was, however, the beginning of a new chapter. As the prisoners were liberated and returned to their respective countries, the emotional and psychological impact of their time in captivity lingered. The women in particular found it difficult to adjust to life outside the camp. They had been changed forever by their experiences. The war had robbed them of their innocence, but it had also shown them their own strength. The bond between the men and women forged in the shared struggle of captivity was one that would endure. The moment they ate together was symbolic of a deeper, unspoken connection, a connection born not out of romantic or physical attraction, but out of a shared experience of suffering and survival. The story of these prisoners, particularly the women, is one that transcends the boundaries of war. It is a story of human resilience in the face of overwhelming odds, a story of people who, despite the cruelty of their captors, refused to lose their humanity. The small moment of rebellion, men and women eating together, was just one of many small acts of resistance that would ultimately define their survival. It was a quiet declaration that, despite the horrors of war, the human spirit could not be completely broken. In the years that followed, the women who survived the camp went on to lead remarkable lives. They rebuilt their families, their communities, and their countries. Some went on to become leaders in their own right, while others quietly carried the weight of their experiences, passing on their stories to the next generation. The world they returned to was forever changed by the war, but so too were they. They were not the same women who had entered the camp years earlier. They were survivors, each one marked by the indelible imprint of the war. Their shared experiences, the pain, the suffering, the moments of solidarity, became a part of their collective memory, a memory that would never fade. The broader implications of this event in the camp and its place in the war's larger narrative cannot be overstated. It was a moment of psychological and moral liberation for the prisoners, a moment that signaled the collapse of the power structures that had kept them in captivity. It was a turning point, not just in the war, but in the history of human resilience. The war had torn the world apart, but it also revealed the strength of the human spirit. It showed that even in the darkest moments, hope could still be found. The story of these women and the men who shared their experience is a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable suffering, the human capacity for survival, solidarity, and dignity is unyielding. This moment, when men and women ate together, may have seemed like a small act, but it was in fact a profound testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It was a quiet victory, one that would echo long after the war's end. In the lives of the survivors and in the history of the world, this is the story of how, in the midst of war, the lines between enemy and prisoner blurred, and in the process humanity emerged unbroken.